Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show, where we help you make the wisest and most profitable decisions. My name is Dr. Gleb Tsipursky. I'm the CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts, the future of work consultancy that sponsors the Wise Decision Maker Show. I'm joined today by William. William, can you please introduce yourself and share a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, thank you. Nice to be here. So my name is William West. I am currently the VP of People at Wrapbook. We are an entertainment financial services company. Provide payroll, accounting services, and software to companies in the entertainment industry. Have worked in people, HR roles
Mhm.
for a little over 15 years, and excited for the conversation today.
Nice. Thank you, William. And what do you see as the biggest benefits of flexible work? What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, so I was forced into flexible work about five
Mm,
years ago, along with many
okay.
people,
Yeah.
but have found myself in remote like distributed teams uh,
Mhm.
over the past 5 years since then. Um, and I think of it in a few different ways.
Mhm.
One is uh, distributed team for us has given us some really excellent access to a broad range of talent that we might not
Mm,
otherwise have. I saw a post earlier today from a company that resonated with me talking about
mhm.
this idea that they have really embraced the fact that they have a group of people who are all in the same or kind of from this certain set of places and not from like San Francisco as an example.
Mm,
Because in that way, they were able to build a company that was really true to their mission and their values in a way that
mhm.
actually having access to tech talent that is maybe more ubiquitous was less attractive to them. So I thought that was interesting. But just in general, we've got people throughout the US and Canada, and that sort of access to a pretty wide pool of talent has been one. I think
Mhm.
second, the DEI diversity has been a topic of a
Mm,
lot of conversation in the US, particularly to start the year.
mm,
We care deeply about and believe deeply in the value and benefit of building diverse teams because we have a diverse client base and we want to make
mm,
the best decisions and think that multiple different inputs into
mhm,
that diverse inputs help us do that. And so, again, the benefit of not being locked into any one locale enables us
mhm,
to do that and get people from backgrounds, walks of life, experiences,
mhm,
etc. I think the third, which is becoming more uh, increasingly more important, I think it's always been the case, just is around
mhm,
cost. So the reality
mm,
of being able to bring together people who and focus on, one place is Canada has been, we've been fairly intentional and at past places have been fairly intentional about
mhm,
wanting to keep things in North America for sake of culture and communication. Because
mhm.
we'll talk about some of the friction points in a little bit, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But just cost overall, like we have access to more people in lower
Mhm,
cost cities then enable us to then be really thoughtful and strategic about how we're managing that. So, like scratching the surface, there's certainly benefits on the other side. I'm also an employee of these places, and so,
mhm.
for me personally, that's meant flexibility. Like we got a
Oh,
puppy this year, and
oh.
that never would have happened if I didn't work in a flexible remote environment.
Mhm,
It's also, I'd say, to enable me to focus and be really a lot more intentional about how and where I use my time
mm,
too, because in many ways I can sort of control the environment that I'm in.
mhm,
So as an employee, that sort of focus and intentionality has also been really critical. So there's a smattering of a few, both from
mhm.
the person who's thinking about this at a company level, and then also just as a human who's showing up to work every day.
I like that connection of the human leader. Now, you talked about friction points. What are the three biggest friction points that you see with distributed work?
Yeah. One of the biggest that actually were my first few months at my current company started just to talk about this, not because there was a problem, but because I could see where it happened, is this idea of incomplete stories and the idea
Mm,
that we in a remote or flexible environment, what happens is you often get little snippets of information. You get
Mhm.
snippets of a conversation, whether that's in a Zoom meeting or in a Slack message or in a Notion page. And what we then do is we take those snippets and we create a story. And when
Mhm.
things are going really positive and well, that's usually a pretty positive story. And inevitably, if something is not going well, or if there's a lack of clarity, that can become negative and have negative
Mhm.
effects to relationships and trust, and also just the ability to do the work. And so that is one, is this idea that we have more limited information without those sort of serendipitous touch points that you get when you're with people more
Mhm.
consistently, which then can start to break down trust. So that is certainly one. I think related to that is it can be lonely. Like, just very
Mhm.
simply, again, as a human, there is that lack of regular connection. My wife and my children, they're gone all day, as an example for me. And so, and that's the life of a lot of people who find themselves in these
Mhm.
situations. So there can be this lack of connectedness that can happen. And that has, a broad range of effects. In some cases that can affect retention and tenure, because if people don't feel
Mhm.
connected to one another in a mission, they're less likely perhaps
Mhm.
to want to stay at a place longer, especially if things get hard. So that's the second for me. And then
Mhm.
third, at a company level, and this also feels like similar to like the comment on cost earlier. So the flip of that is this idea of how do we measure productivity and how do we get
Mhm.
a real good sense of what how much are people ultimately contributing. So the
Mhm.
positive is you get this flexibility, and people, in many ways, there's a much higher trust environment required within a remote environment. The other
Yeah.
side of that is this idea of how do you help ensure that people are doing what they say they're going to do, and it requires much more intentionality around how you're sort of measuring and evaluating output. So those
Mhm.
that, in my experience, especially from the employer side, can be um, one of the bigger sort of risks or challenges with remote work or distributed work.
Yeah, I could certainly see those challenges, and I've heard that issues before. I'm curious to go a little bit more into the first one and
Yeah,
related to the second one of the context. So there's lower context when people are working remotely, and that inhibits, of course, a sense of connection, which relates to the second one. What have you done to address this kind of context, connection, relationship dynamic? What have you seen work in that regard?
yeah. I think one, which is very simple, is we talked about it. And I think it feels like the most obvious
Hmm.
one, but I think that one of the most important steps to avoiding problems, or like building strength, is just to acknowledge where that could happen even before it's
Hmm.
happening, not as reactive. And
Yeah.
so that's one, is we have a
Hmm.
a company offsite where we bring everyone together, which is also one. I'll talk more about that because that's also one.
Good.
But that was an hour talk, was specifically around
Hmm.
here's what can happen. Let's actually engage in the content, like it's super interactive, um and then here's some tips to go and to address it. So that was one. I mean, two, I think that it's a fallacy to suggest that remote work means never seeing each other and never being
Sure.
together. And so that's the second, is creating really intentional touch points
Hmm.
in person, for one, and having those times that may feel not productive because you're not doing work, but just creating opportunity for people to get to know one another and spend
Hmm.
time together. So at Wrapbook, we do that annually in Cancun. And
Nice.
that has actually been it's my first time in Mexico, actually last September, but was also
Fun.
just a really positive time to
Hmm.
get to see people and have those conversations and put a face to name in a way that
Hmm.
paid dividends down the road.
Nice.
And then doing that at smaller team levels as well. So,
Hmm.
the people team, we get together once a year with that same idea in mind. So that's another
Hmm.
one, is providing some context, which often is just from understanding who people are and where they're coming from. Um, I just across the board, I think it comes back to being really intentional about how and where you're creating those connection
Mhm.
points, both at a company level. So again, like we do a monthly all hands, which back in a life where I was in an office, that might have been quarterly, maybe, whereas the frequency of that has needed to increase within a
Yeah.
distributed environment to help consistently provide that. Um, I think lastly on this, I would say too we invest a lot in managers as a result. So the
Mm.
people who are having the most, I would say, most consistently have the biggest impact on the day-to-day experience of the individual is the manager, for better or
Yeah.
worse. And I think in
Sure.
many ways, companies are made or not made by the success of
Mhm.
how well you equip managers. And so it's really incumbent upon us to make sure that they have what they need to be able to engage with, provide that context, and which also means sometimes being prescriptive. So, what one thing that we started doing is, we we have a regular time where we review like OKRs to a pretty deep degree on how we're
Mhm.
doing, how's the business doing, and what we started doing is having a very clear here's the summary and here's what to do with this information within your teams, and that
Mhm.
taking that additional step, it feels prescriptive, it is prescriptive, but it's often because many of us we take that, we absorb it personally and then we move on with our day, and that's very human, and recognize that
Mm.
we can best equip managers by setting that really clear expectation on you get this information. Here's what you should do with it now, so
Yeah.
that they don't have to digest and perfectly craft that for their teams, but rather they've
Mhm.
got a starting place. And so that has also been something that we've done.
Oh, excellent. One for that one, and that's something I've really seen be very important of training managers and how to do specifically remote work management, hybrid work management effectively. And it's a real challenge because when you go to, from a traditional manager perspective, people are used to walking around, managing by walking around and checking in with people. That doesn't work very well in remote settings. You need to have a one-on-one with each team member once a week, ideally, or once every 2 weeks, where you review their OKRs. If they need to have team member OKRs for each individual team member linked to the broader OKRs for the team, you need to check in on how they're doing and their work-life balance, their sense of isolation, loneliness, and so on, and all their other life. You need to help managers understand how to communicate effectively because managers often don't have the same communication preferences as their team members, and they need to learn how to coordinate around effective communication preferences with their team members and get the whole team aligned on it. You need to have the whole process and system of how the team functions laid out much more clearly when people are in a remote setting than when they're in an in-person setting. You need to have this expectation of how you meet and when you meet and what are the appropriate times for meeting, even how you communicate. Managing managers, for example, don't know that they can communicate not only through virtual meetings, but they can record a video message or an audio message, and they can send that to team members. And that's going to be quite a bit more effective in many ways than a simple text message. You can always do a transcript for the text message, but with a video message or an audio message, you convey the emotions, the nuance, the tone of voice, things that you would not convey in a text message, and also you take quite a bit less time than if you need to schedule a meeting, which I hear a lot of managers saying, well, I want people back in the office because I can't communicate to them normally. I'm like, have you tried video messages? Have you tried audio messages? You can do that. Then you don't have to have these barriers that you imagine you need to schedule meetings with people. So managers really need to be trained on how to do remote work effectively. And sounds like you're doing some of those things.
It really, yeah, I on the last point and then overall, I think the video is a great point that
Mm,
we have done much more intentionally over the last 6 months. And I
yeah,
totally agree, which is seeing a human say something versus words on a page. You add tone,
mm,
you add just context by body language in a way that
yeah,
just never get, in when in just written word. So completely agree with that. I think, one of the things that I think about just in like zooming out, how we do this really well is, and where companies have gotten caught in the trap is that many of us were pushed into remote and distributed work and then tried to just adapt the things that we did
Mm,
previously to the remote environment. And where I've found success is, and for, and really believe that the future of remote work in many ways for
mhm,
companies is for those that have really mastered that intentional connection and are
mhm,
not just letting it happen, but are really designing for it. And so
mhm,
everything from documentation culture to regular meeting cadence to like equipping managers for how and you might actually make that change and even interviewing for
mhm.
it. All of those things are a part of a really need to be a part of a really intentional design.
Excellent point. Now, as we wrap up, what do you see as the future of distributed work in this context where we're talking about the conversations in the government where there's, return to office full time? What do you see as the future of distributed work in overall?
Yeah. I feel like the current state of the world is changing by the moment. So there's a there's an element of buckle up and let's try and figure
Yeah.
out together. Um, I, I certainly see there's movement for many of the larger companies, particularly in tech and in the government,
Mhm,
of bringing people into the office, and I think we'll learn a lot through that. So I think that's
mhm,
one. Um, I if you had asked the same question 2 years ago, you'd probably say remote is the future. And
mhm,
then now here we are 2 years later saying maybe it is. I think there will always be a place for it, especially for
mhm,
small growing companies who,
mhm,
especially with ongoing macro pressure on cost, where in order to build something really quickly, with the right level of intentionality from the beginning, I believe that you can build a strong culture with a diverse team that is executing really well remotely. And I
mhm,
think that that will continue. I think what will have to happen though is we sort of we fell into this before in a lot of ways, and then we have just sought to make it work. I think the future will require more of that intentional design.
mhm,
And I think the advent of new tools that creates efficiency will also increased flexibility, which I think is a
mhm,
good thing, which I think goes in favor of remote work, because we have more flexibility in the work that we do, and then that ultimately enables more focus then on actually delivering the work, which I think is what we need. And so I think there is the general inertia toward more results focus is a good thing. I
mhm,
think that maybe how and where it's directed to, it has to be an office in order to do that. I think will continue to be challenged in some way. And I think it's again where I started. It's kind of a buckle up. I don't know. If I knew,
mhm.
I think I might be in a different place. But
Yeah,
I think there are plenty of benefits, and that it's here to stay. It's just going to require a bit more intentionality in the future.
excellent. Well, thank you, William. Your feedback and your expertise was very helpful.
Of course, I'm glad to have had a conversation today.
And thank you to the audience for checking out another episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show. Please make sure to subscribe wherever you check out the show and leave a review. It helps other people discover the show and helps us improve the show.